In 1986, you were the Republican nominee. You narrowly lost. You lost by, I think it was like less than 1 percentage point.
0.8%.
That loss, though, did it hurt, knowing that it was so close?
Oh, sure. If I had been elected governor during that period of time, I would be now, or would have been in the United States Senate, would have had a seat at the table on all these major issues of this day or the last decade. But by the same token, as I just said, there is life after politics.
Welcome to It's Worth Mentioning, a podcast about local history. I am your host, Rhett Nelson. My guest today is a longtime attorney in the state of Idaho. He's had a law office in Boise for decades, but he's also had an extensive political career in the state. It all began in the 1970s when he ran for prosecutor of Ada County, and from there went on to serve as Idaho Attorney General. At age 31, he was elected to the position. He became the youngest attorney general in the nation at the time. From there, he went on to serve as lieutenant governor for the state of Idaho. As a Republican, he served directly under the leadership of a Democratic governor. Interesting dynamic there. He made a bid for governor against Cecil Andrus, unsuccessfully, and then worked for the federal government under President George H.W. Bush. He was the U.S. nuclear waste negotiator, and he also made a bid for U.S. Congress twice, unsuccessfully. The person I'm talking about is David Leroy. Today, Leroy is a historian, and he's the founder of the Idaho Lincoln Institute. I had the privilege of speaking with David several weeks ago. We talked about his extensive political career and some of his political accomplishments. We kicked off the conversation talking about Abraham Lincoln's ties to the state of Idaho. As you know, Idaho is turning 163 years old in just a few weeks, and Abraham Lincoln is the president who created the Idaho Territory. Abraham Lincoln's connections to the state of Idaho go beyond just creating the territory. So I think you're going to find that piece of our conversation quite fascinating, as well as all of David Leroy's political accomplishments. He pays tribute to his political colleague, and then talks about his extensive political career. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with David Leroy. Excited to get into your background and get to know you a little bit. I did want to start off today, though, as we record this today, Lynden Bateman, a former state legislator who served back in the 70s and 80s, and then again in 2010 to 2016, just passed away. And I know you have had some association with him from your time serving in Boise. I wanted to know if you wanted to say anything about his passing and share any memories of Bateman.
Well, I certainly do. There's a hole in my heart, of course, and I think a hole in Idaho's political situation, having lost Representative Bateman. I called him Mr. History, and I think he was deliciously entitled to that title because he was literally such a significant part of Eastern Idaho history, of our state legislative activity for those span of years that you mentioned. He led the charge on a number of noble initiatives that still operate today. He created Idaho Day. He was the leader and lobbyist and progenitor of the bill that requires cursive in Idaho schools so that our children can continue to understand and read the letters their grandmothers wrote. So Lynden Bateman, a longtime church member, a great family fellow from Idaho Falls, and state legislator, will be long remembered. And not the least of those sites where he's remembered is the Lincoln Auditorium in the basement of the State House, the largest gathering room there. It only took him and me working together for 3 years to get that named after Lincoln, but we did, and we're proud of that achievement too. So I'll miss him greatly, and he is, as the governor said, a noble spirit and a noble Idahoan.
I'm glad you mentioned his association with the Lincoln basement there in Boise. You actually founded an institute, and you'll have to forgive me on I don't have the name off the top of my head, but it's the Idaho Lincoln Institute, something to that effect. And
Yes,
it's
if you Google looktolincoln.org, you'll find the Idaho Lincoln Institute, which was built on kind of an interesting idea to advocate Republican principles, but also to suggest that I think there are about 45 quotes there that Abraham Lincoln authored during his lifetime. And those quotes are designed to be representative of his legislative career, his presidential commentary. And if you take those common sense, very terse, well articulated quotes, you'll find that Lincoln on immigration or Lincoln on freedom or Lincoln on Congress apply with equal force today. And part of our shtick at the Idaho Institute is that we should be a little more like Lincoln even today as we run our country. Now, those Lincoln quotes are very compelling, applicable to Idaho, as well as to the governance of the United States, even these days.
I
And it's
had
look to Lincoln.org.
I had the great fortune last year. You came to the Museum of Idaho in Idaho Falls for Idaho Day on March 4th, and you gave a long address about Abraham Lincoln's connections to Idaho. And I thought that was very interesting. So since we're kind of on this point about Lincoln and Idaho, first of all, can you share like where your interest in Abraham Lincoln came from?
Well, I grew up as a young man in Lewiston, Idaho. My dad was a watch repairman and jeweler up there. Died when I was quite young. My mom was a first grade teacher. And I would always, with my brothers, walk to the city library on the weekends and get a book or two. I became interested in presidents, lawyers who were presidents, and presidents who were lawyers. And in that context, became acquainted with and enjoyed history. I went out to the airport as a 13-year-old boy when John Kennedy in 1960 flew into town to meet some Democratic leaders, and I was fortunate enough to stand at the bottom of the stairway of his airplane, the Caroline, and be the third one in Lewiston, Idaho, I guess in Idaho that year, to shake John Kennedy's hand. And I realized that I was in a receiving line where I shouldn't be. But as Kennedy got to me, having shaken the hand of the Congresswoman, the state senator, I held my hand out and said sheepishly, "Senator, can I shake your hand too?" And he looked at me and said, "Son, you sure can." So from that moment, I was not only bookish about presidents and politics, but of course, engaged. I organized my eighth grade homeroom for Kennedy. We won the straw ballot. And of course, Kennedy won the presidency and told us that we should be concerned about what we could do for our country. And I bought into the program.
Gotcha. So, forgive me, maybe I missed it. So, how did that tie into your interest in Lincoln?
Well, I continued to read and study and work generally about presidents, and I learned particularly sharply in 1963 that Lincoln had created Idaho Territory. It was a great surprise to me. I had no idea we had those kinds of connections to a president like that. In addition, one of my dad's friends gave me a little teeny penny-sized coin that had Lincoln's picture on one side and Hannibal Hamlin on the other side. And lo and behold, it was a Lincoln campaign token. And so Lincoln in Idaho, Lincoln in politics, Lincoln saving the Union, all of those things continue to be of great interest to me. And as I continue to develop a campaign button and political collection, a book collection in my little bookcase in my room, Lincoln figured prominently among those collectees.
So, as I mentioned, I was fascinated on your speech at the Museum of Idaho last year to learn about Abraham Lincoln's connections to Idaho. One of the most notable connections, not only did he sign the bill that created the Idaho Territory, but he was good friends with former Idaho Territorial Governor William Wallace. Do you want to talk about his relationship with Wallace a little bit?
Sure. Wallace family history suggests that Wallace met Lincoln in Indiana when Wallace was there, and Lincoln made a campaign swing of some kind through there in the 40s, 50s, well before his presidential ambitions. And they remained friends after Wallace introduced Lincoln. Wallace ultimately, in the mid 1850s, came out to Washington Territory and became acquainted with a man named Anson Henry, who was the family physician for the Lincoln family in the city of Springfield, Illinois. And together they corresponded with Lincoln back and across the country. They would write about organizing Oregon for Lincoln during the presidential run. Lincoln wrote them a note saying how disappointed he was that he'd been defeated by Douglas in 1858. That kind of correspondence back and forth across the country kept Lincoln and Wallace engaged together over that period of time. And then when Lincoln was finally elected to the presidency, Wallace decided he would go back and see if he could be appointed to something, and lo and behold, he was. He became, first of all, the governor appointed by Lincoln to Washington Territory in the early 1860s, was elected by Washington Territory subsequently to go back and be the delegate to Congress for that territory. And when he arrived back there in the fall of 1862, he and Henry and others had decided that Washington Territory should be split into an eastern and a western division. Idaho Territory became the eastern division, and Wallace received his second appointment from his friend Abraham Lincoln. This time he came back out here to be governor of Idaho Territory and arrived in Lewiston, Idaho Territory in July of 1863.
You theorized, though, in your address at the Museum of Idaho that William Wallace, had he accompanied Abraham Lincoln to Ford's Theater the day that he was shot, might have prevented the assassination. You want to talk
Well,
about that?
you've caught me in one of my rhetorical speculations, but I admit it, I plead guilty. Sure. Wallace went to see Lincoln on the very last day of Lincoln's life in the White House, and in so doing, was toward the end of their meeting invited to go to Ford's Theater that night with Mary and Abraham Lincoln to see the play Our American Cousin. They couldn't go. Mrs. Wallace was ill. But the result of that, of course, was that others were in the box with Lincoln, and that gives me the ability to speculate that should a robust young Western governor and territorial delegate such as Wallace been seated at just the right place in the presidential box, perhaps, just perhaps, the event could have been interrupted. I do think it's fair to assume that Wallace, for the rest of his life, after Lincoln was assassinated, one would have wondered whether there was something he could have done, should have done differently had he been there.
Another connection that I find fascinating that you talked about is President Zachary Taylor gave Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to serve as governor of what was then Oregon Territory, which included modern-day Idaho. Lincoln, of course, declined that, but you were very excited at the thought that Lincoln could have been governor of Idaho.
Rich, you're doing a superb job of picking up on the nuances of Western and Lincoln history, and I'm proud of you. Yes, Lincoln was a defeated one-term congressman in 1848-49, and Taylor was the incoming president, and both of them were members of the Whig Party. So the president had political patronage to dispense and offered Lincoln the secretaryship of Oregon Territory as a political plum for his one term, 2 years of service representing Illinois in the Congress. Lincoln thought that was beneath him, so he declined that readily, but the ante was up. The president offered the governorship of Oregon Territory, which it would have made him literally our first governor of this landmass had he taken the job. But I think he was inclined to be favorable toward it because he always had a fascination with the further west than the west of Illinois. Went home, talked to Mary, and she said no.
Yeah.
So we lost our chance, but he preserved his chance, I think, to become president by staying in Eastern politics rather than coming out here.
So we did an in-depth article about Lincoln's connections to Idaho, and for people who were watching, we will include a link to that in an article below this video and in the show notes if you're listening in audio format. I highly recommend it though, because if you're a history buff of any kind, it's Abraham Lincoln is a beloved figure in history. Anyone who's interested in history loves Lincoln, and then to hear about his connections to the Gem State is equally fascinating. Something you don't learn about in school. David, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about your background. You have spent many decades as an attorney, and in fact, you're speaking to us today from your law office in the Boise area. What prompted you to pursue law as a career?
About that same time that I was becoming interested in presidents and lawyers and presidents, I began to be active in student politics too. I was elected student body president in my high school, went to Boise State, joined the team of kids from my school that went to the youth legislature. And in so doing, you had to propose a bill to the legislature, attempt to lobby it through, maybe get the governor to sign it. And so I told my mother that I needed to figure out how to write a piece of legislation. She called her local lawyer, and they said they would be glad to receive me and talk about that. So I went down to Win Blake's office on Main Street in Lewiston. They sat me in the conference room, sent a young lawyer, a very young lawyer named Merlin Clark, who's now still practicing mediation in Boise, into the room to tell me and show me and answer my questions. He produced a pamphlet called How to Write a Bill from the Office of Secretary of State, Pete T. Cinerusa. We talked a little bit about some ideas. I was seated at a long table with a bank of law books right in front of me, and I landed on my idea, began writing my language in the format that the pamphlet suggested I should. I began thinking about how I was going to convince a group of people that I did not know on the floor of the youth legislature, state senate, to prefer my bill over others and to vote yes. So I'm sitting there in this atmosphere with this challenge that not only was immediate in terms of finding the words and working with the ideas, but also contemplating the ability to convince others in some future form and format and using formal rules like rules of procedure, how to change something for the better in the future. And the thought struck me, I could do this job. I like this job. And that was kind of my seminal moment on deciding that instead of being a doctor and I didn't like blood much, that I'd be a lawyer.
In your years as an attorney, is there one case that stands out to you for being particularly noteworthy or memorable?
Well, I was, as Attorney General of Idaho, privileged to appear 3 times before the United States Supreme Court. 2 of those I personally argued, and when you appear in that forum, it's shocking how intimate that arena is. You're in a grand courtroom with high ceilings and noble velvet drapes, a marble bench in front of you, but as you stand at the attorney's rostrum, the attorney is literally about 12 feet nose to the Chief Justice of the United States. And when you say, Mr. Chief Justice and members of this honorable court, I'm pleased to appear here today on behalf of the state of Idaho. That's pretty significant. 2 of those cases were involving our state's interest in first anadromous fishery coming back up the Columbia and Snake River systems to Idaho, the salmon and steelhead. We directly sued Oregon and Washington. Another one was actually against my gubernatorial nemesis, Cecil Andrus. We sued him for a clarification of laws related to the development of federal lands under the Carry Act. Those, of course, were very memorable cases. In terms of a prosecutorial case, I was able one time to obtain a conviction in a murder case where a woman named Sally Needs had allegedly killed her boyfriend, husband, but we had significant problems those days because the development of scientific evidence as we now know it was not nearly so far advanced. The murder had occurred somewhere in southern Idaho. They were driving a large recreational vehicle together. We know they were seen, and he was last alive in Twin Falls. We suspect that she may have killed him in Elmore County. A torso was found in the desert of Gem County with no head and no arms. Thus, we had no fingerprints and no dental records. But we were able to obtain a conviction in Ada County, suggesting to an Ada County jury that he, beyond a reasonable doubt, was killed in our jurisdiction, and identify the torso as that of Mr. Needs by a scar underneath his right large toe that his mother said that he had obtained as a youth. So that was really a circumstantial case with significant jurisdictional complications in which I was able to represent the people of the county of Ada and obtain a conviction.
Wow.
Interestingly enough, though not known to the jury, Ms. Needs had been previously convicted of killing a boyfriend in California, so it was a pretty high stakes case.
Yeah, wow. You talked about appearing before the Supreme Court when you were serving as Idaho Attorney General. Let's talk about your time as Attorney General. So at age 31, it was 1978, you were elected to this position, and you were the youngest Attorney General in the nation at that point in time. I don't know if that was something that you ever thought about at the time, or since, but do you have any comment just about that, being the youngest one in the nation?
Well, I do, because I think it reflects on the opportunity of our state as to moving upward and onward and attainments in almost any profession. I was moving swiftly through a law career, cheated the University of Idaho out of a year of studies by getting into a 3-and-3 program and got through law school in 6 years instead of 7. I went back to New York University and obtained there a 1-year degree, postdoctoral degree in trial practice and procedure, and was practicing criminal law in New York City in a nationally significant law firm. We represented the Cubans who were caught inside the Watergate building. We did some of the French Connection drug defendants. It was a very prominent practice, and I was reasonably well compensated. And had I stayed in New York City and continued in that practice at age 45 or 50 or 55, I probably could have run for district attorney in the city of New York and represented prosecutions in Manhattan. But I got a call one day from Jim Risch, who was the Ada County prosecutor at the time, now our United States Senator. And he said, "Dave, how'd you like to take a 2/3 cut in pay and come back to Boise, Idaho, and be a deputy prosecuting attorney?" And I said, "Well, why don't you put me on the maybe list?" But then he said two things that were really quite compelling. First and foremost, he said, "If you're such a hotshot trial lawyer, you can come back to Boise, Idaho, Ada County, and try 5 jury trials a week and actually get into the courtroom and explain to people the proposition that you're selling and see what the jury thinks." By contrast, in New York City, the courts were so clogged that if I had a jury trial set, it would be set out about 3 years, and all my witnesses would either die or move to Miami, and it was very problematic to actually get in the arena with the jury in a criminal case. And then he said something else that was very important. He said, "We're looking for somebody to come back and run for prosecuting attorney next year. I'm going to run for the state senate. And we think that you would be an excellent candidate to run from inside the office to succeed me." And that, in a sense, was an offer to come back and be the youngest this and the youngest that, as contrasted to staying in New York City and waiting 20 years to run for district attorney. So I did come back. I was elected in 1974 to the first of two-year terms as Ada County prosecuting attorney, and then went on, as you just indicated, to be Attorney General of Idaho. And that was a singular experience, and it was a great challenge, but I had a superb staff, interestingly enough, both Republicans and Democrats who were experts in their field. And we had a very successful attorney generalship where we did institutional changes, where we were on top of all the issues of the day, and I think made a significant contribution to the foundation that makes Idaho the legal stronghold that it is today.
In the capacity of Attorney General, that's quite the story. Just for Jim Risch to give you a call personally and say, "Hey, come take a 2/3 cut in pay and come to Idaho." But just in your time as Attorney General, do you have one case there that stands out to you?
Well, I think it was a time when we had a lot of issues regarding public lands. We were in the middle of what was a so-called sagebrush rebellion, where a lot of attorneys general and a lot of local politicians were making the push once again to reclaim the title to these 60+% of federal lands that are in Idaho, or similar percentages in other western states. That was a large part of what was going on in the time. But I think in terms of just one case in which I appeared, the one that had the most potential for significance was the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution, which has never been adopted. That was pending adoption. The Idaho legislature, when it was first proposed as an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, rushed in and adopted it, recommended to the Congress of the United States that it would endorse that change to our United States Constitution. Then, a couple of years later, changed its mind. And the Idaho legislature attempted to rescind its prior approval. That case ended up in our federal district court. And the question was, does the state of Idaho, or any sovereign state, once having approved a proposed constitutional amendment, while the counting is still going on, still have the right to withdraw that and affect thereby the count? A question of foundational significance in terms of that sacred document, our Constitution. We briefed that, we appeared on that. We won the case before Judge Marion Callister in the federal court. He ruled that, yes, the state does have the ability to rescind that. We were in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit on appeal, on our way to the Supreme Court, when the clock ran out on the amount of time that the Congress had allowed for states to ratify that. So our resistance was never validated by the Supreme Court, but our resistance was part of the reason that it having been taken note of by other states, there was not a rush to adopt that particular amendment.
Yeah.
It wasn't really a case, and I have a glorious daughter, a glorious wife. It wasn't a case where it was anti-woman. it was a case where the process of guarding, amending, and continuing to create our United States Constitution was extremely important. And among the cases that I worked on as Attorney General, even including those that did go to the United States Supreme Court, that was one that gave me a chance to put my hands in the machinery of the founding fathers, and that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I bet. I noted that your colleague Lyndon Bateman, that we were talking about earlier, who just passed away, he was involved in voting for this because he was in office at the time. So that's interesting that you played a role in moving this legislation forward. You serve as Attorney General and you serve one term. Is that correct?
I did one 4-year term, and then I had an opportunity to run either for governor or lieutenant governor. My friend Phil Batt was determined to run for governor, and though I perhaps could have given him a vigorous contest in the gubernatorial race in the primary, I determined that I would run for lieutenant governor. That also allowed me, as a young man with a growing family, to continue to practice law, or to go back into the practice of law, having completed a full-time job as Attorney General. The lieutenant governorship in Idaho is a part-time task, so you can have a profession outside of being lieutenant governor. And so I determined that I would both do law and politics, and was successful in defeating a very respected state senator named Mike Mitchell, who was Cecil Andrus's hand-picked choice for lieutenant governor. Once again, potentially bedeviling and interacting with Cecil Andrus, I was elected lieutenant governor.
It's interesting. It's noteworthy to me that when you were lieutenant governor, you served under Governor John Evans, who was a Democrat. You are a Republican. So that's an interesting dynamic. You've got a Democrat and a Republican working together to lead the state of Idaho. That's not something that I think would happen in politics today, but any comment about that? Just that dynamic.
Sure, actually, it was a fabulous experience. I think both John, were he alive, and I would report the same. There were, of course, political tensions and political divisions in those days, different approaches to the same issues, of course. But the first day that we were both serving in office inside the State House, I sat down and wrote a list of about 12 things I would like to do, and like to have the governor allow me the privilege to do, some requiring appointment or authority from him. I took my list, walked down the hallway into the governor's office, sat on the other side of his desk, presented my list, and said, "John, here's how I propose that we work together. And these are the things that I would like to take the lead on as either lieutenant governor or acting governor when you're out of the state." And we had a cordial conversation. He took my list, said he'd think about it, and I went back to the lieutenant governor's office. Well, he didn't call the first day, didn't call the second day, and then a little time continued to pass. But as he got closer and closer to the first time that he was going to go out of state and leave me as acting governor, of course, he became far more interested in looking at the content of my list. And so just before he left the state, he called me back down. We talked a bit more, and he gave me 11 and a half of the 12 things I wanted to do beyond this commission, take the lead on these kinds of issues. But the most significant was that I agreed that I would not, while he was out of state, appoint anyone to vacancies in Democrat offices, whether it's legislators or local officials. And by the same token, he allowed me to appoint all Republican vacancies in the state that occurred during that 4 years. That was a great concession and a great basis for a fine working relationship. Occasionally, I would issue press release where I strongly disagreed with something he did. During a certain period of time, my brother Steve Leroy had been John Evans's press secretary. So it was kind of confusing reading some of the stories where he was talking on behalf of governor, and the text would say, Leroy said, Leroy said. You were not sure which Leroy was saying. But John and I had a fine working relationship. We got along well. The state's interests were advanced collectively and mutually. And I got to do some very unique things, like on one occasion as lieutenant governor in a flooding situation, I even called out the National Guard. So we got along well.
Yeah. Wow. But that's just an interesting thing to, I mean, in today's world, that's something that I don't think voters would ever, it's a completely different playing field. I don't think voters think that way. Do you have any lessons of, from your experience working with someone in a different party? Anything you want to comment on to politics today in
Well,
regards
sure.
to that?
Obviously, we're in a period in our country's history, and to a lesser extent, a much lesser extent in our state's history, where there's some polarization that gets in the way of progress. It seems to me that those were easier times, and that cordiality was much more prevalent. Things moved slower. Legislators had desks on the floor, seated side by side. We didn't have quite so much in the way of electronic media. Instead, even reporters themselves would wander the corridors and have genteel conversations with people about issues and personalities, et cetera, et cetera. I guess the lesson for today would be slow down a bit, get to socialize a bit more with those peers with whom you're interacting to make public policy. If we could be less strident, if we could be less on the extremes of both parties and more cooperative about finding collaborative solutions, perhaps we could grab a little bit more of those good old days. When there's something particularly going badly in the country, when there's a grave threat of international this or domestic that, as we watch our national debt climb out of the basement through the house and into the ceiling. I will sometimes interact with somebody in a personal conversation or a political conversation by saying, the world ran better when I was in charge. And there's a lot of people that agree with that.
So I want to get into more of your, the focus of this conversation today was intended to be about your political resume a little bit, but staying on this point for just a minute, because I think this is an interesting little conversation point is, we do live in a time that's so polarized. And as someone who's kind of a longtime political historian in Idaho, is there one election or one individual that you would credit as the person that has made politics so divisive, or like who made it so that we're loyal to the party rather than being loyal to what's best for the state of Idaho, kind of thing? Can you point to one election that kind of where that started?
We're in our America 250 year. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of our nation's so-called founding from the Declaration of Independence. And in getting prepared for a series of speeches that I'll be giving in upcoming months, I've been rereading a lot of the histories of those times with Jefferson and Adams and Washington and Thomas Paine. And frankly, as sharp as our dialogue is today, it appears to me that it was just as nasty sometimes, and perhaps even a little more nasty on some of those occasions when the presidential electors race ended up tied and the choice of a president was thrown into the House of Representatives of the United States. Certainly, our dialogue and the rupture between the North and the South is not as sharp as it was and as it became, losing 600,000 of our own citizens on our own soil during the Civil War. Other equally bad times in the later 19th century and our own 20th century had some problematic times. Old Joe McCarthy and the communist scares of the 50s. So we do have some very problematic dialogue going on these days. I frankly think that some of that is partially attributable to the fact that the media itself has become more polarized and choosing sides and opinionated. I'd love to have one or two or three Walter Cronkites, that voice on the television that I grew up with could tell me something and I'd rely on it 100% as true and relatively apolitical. But I don't think in terms of anything in recent history, any one election, any one issue, or any one person is a focal point from which all of this current polarization generates. Now, although we certainly have a president who is a very polarizing figure, Trump derangement syndrome is evident, not just on a weekly basis or a daily basis, but leaping from issue to issue, hour to hour. So we certainly have a polarizing president and a polarizing Congress, but it's not worse than it once upon a time has been frequently.
And that's good for people to know, because people will say this is worse than it's ever been. But if you look back in history, it's been much worse than this. So
simply not so.
Yeah. You mentioned Cecil Andrus earlier. You defeated his handpicked choice to become lieutenant governor to succeed Phil Batt, and you beat the odds there and were elected instead of Cecil Andrus's pick. But you ran against Cecil Andrus as governor at one point. In 1986, you were the Republican nominee. You narrowly lost. You lost by, I think it was like less than 1 percentage point.
0.8%.
And what are your memories of that election?
Well, Cecil and I both were from the same part of Idaho. He was a logger from Orofino up the river from Lewiston, and I was a kid from Lewiston. My mom was favorably acquainted with him, and he was a Democrat, and Lewiston was a Democrat town, and I was a Republican kid, an outlier in a Democrat family, et cetera, et cetera. So we were not personally unfriendly at all. I ran for lieutenant governor, as I mentioned earlier, partially to continue to build my political credentials and give my family an economic base in law, should I need that and want to come back to that ultimately someday. And in 1986, I was set up perfectly to be the next governor of Idaho as a very popular lieutenant governor of the Republican persuasion in a Republican state. There was only one man in America who could have beat me for that job, and that was Cecil Andrus, the Secretary of the Interior. And I certainly was the only man in America who could beat him. And he decided after about 6 months after I had announced, 14 months out or so, that I was going to run for governor, and he was going to come back and be the Democrat nominee. Neither one of us had a primary, a very rare situation, attesting to what I've just said about the one man in America. And it was a noble battle. I was outraised in terms of funding, but I had worked hard for literally 8 years from within the State House to become governor. The issues were not unfavorable with me, and it was basically a very clean race where Cecil presented his personality and I presented my political base and emerging personality. And we campaigned hard. He was not overly inclined to debate me. He only agreed to one debate, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and he not so much. Nevertheless, on election night, it appeared that I had been successful as the South Idaho reports were coming in, and The margins continued, of course, to narrow into the evening. There was no winner at midnight or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, but eventually that next morning, Cecil appeared to have won by about 3,500 votes out of, I don't even remember what the tally was, half a million or more cast, 0.8%, about 3,500 votes. If there had been a switch of 1,800 votes, about 1 vote, I believe, per precinct throughout the state of Idaho, I would have been the next governor. I was, of course, urged by some of my people to make a contest of it and do some recounts and recalls, but I instead arranged with the Attorney General to hold a press conference early afternoon the day after Election Day, and congratulated Cecil, as I had privately on the phone, as being reelected governor. We remained personally friendly through the campaign. We remained personally friendly through the succeeding years, and I'm glad that he was and remains a governor of great repute. He did some good things for Idaho. I would like to think that I could have given Idaho a solid environmental base and maybe a little bit more of a business-oriented and progressive conservative policy base than he did a little earlier. But Cecil Andrus certainly didn't destroy the state during that set of second terms.
Yeah. And of course, Cecil Andrus went on to serve another term after that, which completed his record as being Idaho's only 4-term governor.
And the bad thing about coming in second in the governor's race is not coming in second in the governor's race, but it's being frustrated that you don't have the ability to do all of those things for your constituent or would-be constituents that you promised. You don't have the opportunity to put those plans and proposals and those changes and nuances into play. And that's hurtful, but there is life after politics.
Yeah, yeah. That loss, though, did it hurt, knowing that it was so close? I mean, to this day, do you look back on that and have regrets, or wish you could have had the opportunity?
Oh, sure. If I had been elected governor during that period of time, I would be now, or would have been in the United States Senate, would have had a seat at the table on all these major issues of this day or the last decade. It's nice to think that you were that close to those kinds of things, but by the same token, as I just said, there is life after politics. I've made a fairly noble career in terms of law. I've been able to give my children and family more attention. I have turned Abraham Lincoln into a cottage industry. And the kinds of things that I have been able to do in terms of Idaho and politics and history have been legion as well. And as I think you mentioned in your intro, I did go on to another political distinction, working for the President of the United States.
As nuclear waste negotiator.
Fascinating job. I got a call one day from the White House in 1990 from Ron Kaufman, the director of presidential personnel, an acquaintance of mine, whom I had made during those governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general years. And he asked me how I'd like to take a job called United States Nuclear Waste Negotiator. And I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, basically you sell nuclear waste to governors and Indian chiefs. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. But I said, well, let me think about it. And the post really was a very important, very significant, and very novel approach to solving problems for the United States government. The Department of Energy had been spectacularly unsuccessful in siting facilities to store spent commercial fuel from reactors, and it was piling up at all these more than 120, I think, reactors at the time all over the country. And they had decided in the Congress in 1987 to create a post that would go out and look for volunteers among states and tribal organizations and some offshore protectorates as well, to see if somebody would volunteer to be a site instead of being forced to be a site by United States Department of Energy policy or the Congress. And this job really was not so much about nuclear waste as it was about finding a new way of solving national problems. So once I perceived that and recognized that I would have the opportunity to create a brand new, never before federal agency and put all of that together, I was excited about the task and did it for 3 years. And we were actually successful in finding a cadre of potential volunteers.
And of course, Cecil Andrus as governor, one of his most um, well-known things that he did was, take a stand against Idaho becoming a dumping ground for the nation's nuclear waste. There's that story that's told of him, holding up the federal rail car with a shipment, and in retrospect, he ended up saying that I didn't actually have the authority to do that, but the federal government flinched, and his bluff seemed to work. But
well, the interesting thing about nuclear byproducts is that they're labeled waste, but particularly in the case of spent commercial fuel, they're actually a highly valuable resource potentially if they are recharged and reused. The interesting thing about being nuclear negotiator, and I was called the most unpopular man in America by the New York Times, or the Sultan of Swill by another periodical, is that the ability to work through this NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard syndrome, is actually a sociological, political endeavor, not a scientific or waste related endeavor. And the creating of relationships where local jurisdictions would make a proposal to Congress about how they would propose to solve something safely and securely in their own backyards was actually a very important exercise for the government. And we're still trying to do it today as nuclear comes back around resurgent in its importance in this AI need more electricity era of American life.
Just on this note of you serving as nuclear waste negotiator, I just think it's worth noting. I believe your successor for this position was Richard Stallings, who also just recently passed away, who we've highlighted in another episode of this program. So, anyway,
That's correct. I guess I'm lucky I was the youngest attorney general. I'm outlasting some of these people.
yeah, yeah. Well, so you served as nuclear waste negotiator for, I think, 3 years then. And
Correct.
then from there, you made a run for Congress. In 1994, you ran for Congress in Idaho's first district. Um, you finished second behind Helen Chenoweth in the Republican primary. So you didn't even become the nominee in the state of Idaho.
That's correct. I was urged to resign my post as nuclear negotiator and get into the race. And had I done so, I would have, again, I think, been the leading candidate. Helen Chenoweth was a former state party chairman and a very conservative woman of a great personality. She began very early and ran very long. And instead of getting into the race when I was urged by political leaders to do so, I said, look, I want to complete this task as negotiator. And so for the next year, instead of campaigning, I waited until Bill Clinton was elected and was asked to remove myself from the negotiator's office in, I think, July of that next year. The Chenoweth campaign was already well advanced by that time, so I got into the race too late. And while that was a poor political, tactical decision, it was the right thing to do for the United States government because I held that important post and advanced it as far as I possibly could. I don't second guess that decision, but again, the politics of a primary did not favor me at that time.
Yeah. And that was really your last foray into politics for many, many years until 2017 when you ran for the same position. You ran against Russ Fulcher.
I didn't need work in that year, but I did perceive that we were headed for national problems with the President of the United States, newly elected to his first term, Donald Trump, ending up with potential problems related to impeachment and needing some support at the congressional level. I felt so strongly about budget issues and other national issues not being solved that I determined that I would run for Congress and present my credentials, suggesting that as a former Attorney General, there was a high probability that I would end up or could be nominated and selected for the House Judiciary and Rules Committee, which, as you know, is where a lot of the action happens on these nationally politically significant issues. So not particularly needing something to do, not wishing to necessarily interrupt my law practice, but I felt that crisis of the times in this country required a learned hand and experienced voice, somebody with some gray hair at the table, and I presented my credentials to the first district voters, and actually was ahead in that race for a considerable period of time until funding from out of state overwhelmed us in the media. Russ ran a good race, and he's certainly grown to be a fine and appropriate congressman representing the first district in the state well on a lot of issues, and I'm pleased that he's there. And in fact, I'm more often than not pleased more that he's there than I would have been myself, simply because of the turmoil in the Congress on all
Yes.
of these issues the last 6 years.
Yes. Um, so David, at this point in your life, do you have any interest at all in, putting your hat in the ring for some political office at all?
My test these days is to stay relevant. Sure, am I younger than some of the politically serving people in our national level, particularly? But I don't think I've got any political work left undone in terms of holding an office. But I certainly do attempt from time to time, either when one of them calls me or when I volunteer a perspective to one of my elected friends or appointed friends to try to influence policy. I'm concerned, of course, that the Republican Party is fractionated into different camps, and I try to keep a foot in all five camps now and then, and steer everybody back toward the happy middle and get everybody back in the tent. But I'm fairly frequently consulted for a little political advice when the legislature's in town, or asked to review the text of a proposed constitutional amendment to see if there are any hidden meanings or potential problems in it. So I stay active in politics. I try to stay relevant. I do a lot of national and regional and local media talking on the issues of the day. And I also try to pick up my phone and occasionally give a little free legal advice to some of my old pals who call me, or somebody that remembers me from the good old days. So on the other hand, I'm basically practicing law full time here in Boise, doing some criminal defense work, a lot of public affairs and political work. So it's exciting to have been where I have been. I've tried to experience one of those lives well lived, but I don't think there's any room in that life, as busy as I am still, for a run for political office.
Yeah. In your work as a historian, we mentioned in the beginning that you founded this Lincoln, Idaho Institute. Um, but are there any, in your capacity as a historian, is there any projects you're working on or things you're doing in that capacity?
Sure. I give a lot of speeches. I try to involve wherever I can young people. I take sometimes interns in my office, in my law office, or do political tutorials. Some of the members of the legislature currently serving are people whom I've encouraged to get into politics. In fact, Speaker of the House Moyle recites an event back in when I was lieutenant governor, and I encouraged him as a Boy Scout to believe that politics is an honorable calling, and I still believe that. But one of the things I'm doing from time to time is scouring the country to see if there are items of political relevance that we can put in our Abraham Lincoln Legacy exhibit out at the Idaho Archives building here in Boise that continue to enhance our display there. We have about 220 artifacts. My wife Nancy Leroy and I have donated about 210 of those, illustrating the chronological life of Lincoln and what was going on out in Idaho during Lincoln's life during those periods, and emphasizing his creation of Idaho Territory in 1863, his appointing of more than 15 people to come out and be our early territorial officers, and showing how Idaho really did have a relevant part of the role of winning the Civil War by our gold and silver coming to the San Francisco Mint, being turned along with California gold, Nevada gold, into $20 gold pieces shipped back east to win the Civil War. So I continue to tell those stories. I continue to look for nationally significant documents or historical items that can be brought to Idaho to tell our story as a part of that nation building process. And for America 250, I've loaned some of my Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson artifacts, including some civil or some Revolutionary War artifacts to the state of Idaho. And there will be an exhibit in the museum on Capitol Boulevard here in Boise that will kick off February 11th and run the entire year, emphasizing America 250 and our relationship 7 years after the issuance of the Declaration and becoming a territory and emerging as one of America's favorite free states in 1890.
Wow, that's great. If people want to stay in the loop about, upcoming America 250 things, or your Lincoln, Idaho Institute, is there a website where people can go?
There is a website, and through the Idaho State Historical Society, you can find that America 250 Idaho website. But what I think is really important, and I'm delighted to have a young man like you be zealous about history, is we have an opportunity in 2026 to concentrate on our origin story as a nation, on our emergence as a territory, on our origin in 1890 as a state. And each of us as a citizen in this state this year has an opportunity to reflect back on those great histories and the freedoms that we have acquired and preserved through those great histories. And then do a personal origin story for what can you do for your nation. As John Kennedy challenged me in 1960s to do something for my country, I hope each one of us in Idaho can have an origin story of emergence this year on doing something more and better and useful for our nation, whether it's running for office or being informed on the issues or just being kind to another citizen who needs a hand up. This is a great year to think about origin stories, including each person's individual.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you very much for your time today, and thanks for your work as a historian. I know as a journalist, I've appreciated having you as a resource that I could reach out to just for clarification on why things are the way they are today. And it's been a delight to talk to you.
Well, it's been my delight, and every time I say something with you, talk to you, interact with you, it's a noble adventure, and it's certainly worth mentioning.
I can't thank David enough for taking time for me. Wonderful conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. We've spoken with David Leroy before for a number of stories, and we will include some of those articles in the show notes for this episode. It will also be linked in the article below this video at eastidahonews.com if you're watching us in video format. By the way, speaking of which, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure and follow our show online. You can follow us. There's a new episode uploaded weekly on the East Idaho News YouTube channel. Sunday evenings, you can watch for it. Just look for It's Worth Mentioning. We're also available in audio format wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure and follow our show. Leave us a 5-star review so that more and more people can find us. For It's Worth Mentioning, I'm your host, Rhett Nelson. We'll see you next time.